Am I coming? Yes, you can hear me. Thank you very much. It's such a honor to be here again in Occulture. And yes, as you may know, or may not know, I've spent the last 10 years working on a biography of a character who is the 20th century's psychedelic Renaissance man, a figure who was on a life quest to learn the role and meaning of psychedelics in evolution, consciousness, and history. An enigmatic figure who referred to himself as an anarcho-cryptic, an edge runner, a mercurial freak who is enigmatic, a figure who is all at once an occult phenomenon, a heroic figure in the psychedelic underground, and at the same time, something of an preposterous anomaly in the world of science, in the world of psychedelic science. Terence McKenna, who died in the year 2000 and the relatively young age of 53, still haunts the present. A figure who was something of a mysteries initiate, a tryptamine mysteries initiate, having been exposed to the mysteries of DMT and psilocybin in particular. And his life was a quest to understand that experience and to effectively initiate countless others into these mysteries through his life and in his afterlife. And but today I'm going to be talking more about how I figure Terence as a leading figure in the modern psychedelic occultural sensibility. And this represents part of an effort to identify McKenna, his role and his place in the history of Western esotericism, and more particularly his place in the American occult tradition. And so I think that McKenna's psychonautical practices make sense within a tradition of libertarian and egalitarian methods of self-transcendence, facilitated by self-taught freak mavericks and maestros and mystics in that tradition. And I'll emphasize his ambivalent relationship with the occult, and hence the accidental component. So some of this content is drawn from this biography, which is which chronicles the life, work, and legacy of one of the most loved yet least understood figures in late 20th century, certainly within psychedelic culture. And I've kind of been something of, I see myself as a sort of cross between Sherlock Holmes and Captain Willard, who's chased Colonel Kurtz up the river. But in this work, I'm no assassin. It's a sympathetic approach, balanced and nuanced. 10 years in the making, 80 people interviewed, extensive research of public and private archives. And this book, by the way, is available in the bookstore here. Signed copies. So there's very little work that's been done to unpack McKenna's cultural sensibility, or indeed McKenna at all, in academia and intellectual culture that is beyond three works that I've listed here. Wrote a Hanegraaff's revisionist work identifying McKenna as an Aronos-esque religionist, and moreover as the figurehead of what Hanegraaff refers to as entheogenic esotericism. There's Eric Davis's, who triangulates McKenna in his study of 70s freak authors, and where McKenna is an inspiration for what Davis refers to as weird naturalism. And the third work is Chris Partridge's High Culture, where he explores the popular occultural impact of McKenna's psychedelic shamanism. So, as I mentioned, Terence had an ambivalent relationship with the occult and esoteric traditions generally. On the one hand, he possessed an animus towards the occult. He was scornful towards spiritualism, theosophy, paranormal and psychical research, and was dismissive of traditions of magic and the New Age. Practitioners of the occult were variously dismissed as elitist, fraudulent, ineffectual, insane, and worse still, unstoned. And this last factor was key to understanding McKenna's approach, as he harbored antipathy toward sober pathways to the other world and was distrustful of the unintoxicated hierophany. And we'll come back to that. But at the same time, he was an habitual accumulator of rejected knowledge, Neoplatonism, Hermetism, alchemy, the I Ching, Gnosticism, science fiction, chaos theory, etc., shaped McKenna's quest for a phenomenology of the other. McKenna enjoyed an abiding interest in Hermeticism and alchemy, inspired by Jung and the work, particularly of Francis Yates. At the same time, he was a refugee from Catholicism, having once even been an altar boy in his hometown of Paonia in Colorado. And as I suggest, ultimately his dismissal of the occult is contradictory, if not ludicrous. Well, you're getting a prelude there. So the corpus Hermeticum afforded McKenna an inspired philosophical model. While there's no evidence that he made any detailed study of these texts, seminarians at Esalen in California and elsewhere were exposed to the primary texts of what he said was a religion of the redemption of the earth through magic. Several of his well-known raps, spoken word performances in the early 90s gave shape to this idea, while McKenna understood the corpus to have originated in the first centuries following Christ. Its provenance has been the subject of considerable debate among historians. The texts of the corpus were imagined to have been produced in the shadows of the waning Roman Empire and were thought oppositional to Christianity and the rationalist materialism of the scientific model. In other words, the approach was modeled on Francis Yates's work, in which, in the context of the 15th century Latin translation of the corpus, the likes of Ficino, Dee, and Pruno emerge as magical avatars of a Hermetic renaissance, pitted against the dominant powers of the church and rationality. The grand narrative of the countercultural Hermetic tradition, i.e. the Yates paradigm and the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, was challenged by Hanegraaff as the opening article in the first edition of Aries, and also his later work esotericism and the academy and other work. But McKenna was little interested in these debates. In any case, he departed before these debates really got going. Post-Yeats, John Dee was celebrated as the true Renaissance man, with McKenna developing a great affinity for the magus, intelligencer, and court astrologer to Elizabeth I. Prized in McKenna's library was the original work edited by Casaubon with the title that I've listed there, which is, I don't even think that's half of the actual title. That the man who interpreted the scried voices of angels was among McKenna's heroes is evident in a strange documentary in which McKenna adopted the assumed persona and raiment of Dee. And this documentary was called The Alchemical Dream, the rebirth of a great work, which was eventually released in 2008. He collected Hermetic texts, notably at least 3 English editions of Henry Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy or magic, dating back to the mid-17th century. I've included here some photos that I recently took at Český Krumlov Castle Library in Czechia. He was also fascinated by the I Ching. He translated the translated and annotated Richard Wilhelm edition, which was among his greatest obsessions, and he made many commentaries on its philosophy and interpretations of its structural logic and symbolism. The I Ching was decoded to discover an ancient Chinese calendar and temporal pattern that he named the time wave. All of which signifies a contradictory approach to the occult, maligned on the one hand and selectively embraced on the other. As earlier indicated, integral to McKenna's unique approach, what he called his special projects, and many people are in possession of this card, which is one of the most, this was his business card, one of the most innocuous looking business cards, but nevertheless well loved. And this was his perception that the righteous pathway to encounter the other was with the assistance of psychoactive tryptamines, notably DMT and psilocybin. He was rather somewhat dogmatic. These plant allies enabled access to the alternate dimensions he understood as hyperspace and the entities that occupied that space. This is a photograph of his residence in Berkeley, in Telegraph Avenue in 65 to 67, where in 65, and this is a house that he sublet to fellow students over those two years. And I'll just read a passage from the book. It was a cold, damp evening on Telegraph Avenue, Berkeley, February 66, as a strange young man in a little black suit buttoned up to the throat mounted the steps and rapped on the door at 2894. A tall, wiry freak bade him entry, held by his host as his great inspiration. The guest is recalled as being always the one to get there first, whatever it was, to do it, to reject it, and to be absolutely contemptuous of it by the time anybody else even arrived at the scene of the crime. On this occasion, the guest had arrived with a little glass pipe and stuff that looked like orange mothballs. Something that might interest you, said Rick Watson. What is it? It's called DMT. How long does it last? 10 minutes. To which McKenna replied, let the good times roll.
I mean, I sank to the floor. I couldn't move, and this disystolic hallucination of tumbling forward into these fractal geometric spaces made of light. And then I found myself in the sort of auric equivalent of the Pope's private chapel. And there were insect elf machines proffering strange little tablets with strange writing on them. And I was aghast, completely appalled, because the transition had been a matter of seconds. And my entire expectation of the nature of the world was just being shredded in front of me. I've never actually gotten over it. I mean, I sank to the floor. I couldn't move, and
From this moment forward, McKenna was driven by an independent course of study that preoccupied him for his remaining days. On the subject of his friend's epiphany in February '66, Rick Watson recalled how Terence announced that he would devote his life to uncovering the origins and meaning of DMT. Henceforth, and for the rest of his life, he became an interdimensional explorer, committed to purveying the mechanics, aesthetics, and phenomenology of hyperspace. His life became a quest to seek traces of the DMT flash in psychology, esoteric traditions, philosophy, art history, architecture, ethnography. He searched in vain for it in Jung, asserting the dominant motive is a flood of visual imagery that, try as one might, one cannot recognize as the contents of either the personal or the collective unconscious. In states of peak intoxication, he found a world of ideas, visual images, noetic insight that really could not be co-mapped on any tradition, even the esoteric tradition. Throughout his questing, he clung tenaciously to the idea that DMT was the philosopher's stone associated with alchemy. In fact, back in 1967, he told his brother Dennis, I know what the philosopher's stone is. It's sitting in that jar right on the bookshelf. Indeed, DMT's metabolism, when taken orally in combination with a Banisterius caapi vine, would give this idea credence, with the ayahuasca becoming known as jungle alchemy. A growing interest in shamanism and the hunt for an organic source of DMT presages the journey to the Amazon in 1971, where he trekked with Dennis and friends in search of the bark of Varroa theodora, thought to contain DMT, and reported to be used by the Witoto in a paste that had hallucinogenic effects. And you can see there the trek that they took down the Putumayo River and across to a place called La Chorrera. In their journey to La Chorrera, they instead found the magic in the form of the mushroom, an abundance of psilocybe cubensis growing in the dung of cattle grazing in the region's pastures. This expedition and the so-called experiments that happened there are the chief subject of McKenna's memoir, True Hallucinations. A few years later, the brothers discovered a method to successfully cultivate the mushroom spores that they brought back from Colombia through the cultivation technique transmitted in psilocybin Magic Mushroom Growers Guide, which ended up selling something like 200,000 copies. They helped initiate a revolution in domestic production. What in '75 was restricted to the world's warm tropical pastures was over the next 10 years spread to, as he wrote or said, every garage and attic from Nome to Santiago. McKenna recognized the rebirth of what he said was the rebirth of a religious mystery to be among his own accomplishments. In his preface to the '86 edition, he observed that having sold over 100,000 copies at that stage, the book was pivotal to a revival in which more people are now actively involved in a religious quest using psilocybin than ever before in history. through their discovery and sharing of a relatively simple means to cultivate cubensis, the brothers became spokesmen for a tryptamine familiar cultural underground whose proliferation echoed the mycelial character of the mushroom itself. In other words, they cultivated an underground network in symbiotic relationship with the practice of growing mushrooms. With his wife of 16, 17 years, Kat Harrison, McKenna started a business, Lux Natura, and a sub-company called Syzygy, the main activity of which was selling mail-order spore kits, effectively seeding sacraments of a grassroots mystery religion. McKenna saw little value in undertaking a hero's journey, i.e. the Joseph Campbellian myth widely adopted among New Age practitioners that was not fueled by a heroic dose of psilocybin mushrooms. His decades-long boosting of the means to reproduce the sacraments of his mystery religion, sometimes deemed Orphic and always central to what he knew as the archaic revival, McKenna claimed that the mushroom cultivated its own futurity by grooming the very qualities in the grower that are opportune for taking mushrooms. The foreword to the Grower's Guide features a long message that the alien intelligence that was understood to be the mushroom conveyed to Terence during an heroic dose. Terence grew accustomed to this inner voice, sometimes called the teacher, other times the logos, sometimes even an angel, but always with an alien sensibility. This internal dialogue with the alien other began in the immediate aftermath of the experimental era on March 4th, 1971, and effectively continued for nearly two decades. Over that time, courting him like an inner soulmate, the mushroom guided Terence in matters of love and business. The view was persistent, even dogmatic. Transpersonal encounters without psychedelics or shamanic plants weren't to be trusted. Unintoxicated encounters with the other, like channeling, were impugned. On the subject, for example, on the subject of the extraterrestrially channeled Book of Urantia, a New York City audience was once informed that if you can channel without drugs, you're probably mentally ill. He received the likes of Russian esotericists Ouspensky and Crowley as charlatans and little more than what he wrote in his diary, misguided victims of strange circumstances. In the case of Ouspensky, what appeared surprising to McKenna is that the fourth dimension could be accessed without organic tryptamines. Indeed, those claiming astral flight, time travel, spirit contact, and communion with the dead, among other manifestations of the noumenal, were imagined as inauthentic because they were not turned on. McKenna appeared to be unfamiliar with Crowley's prodigious self-experimentism with peyote and notably hashish, very potent strains of which had fueled the practice of magic in mid-20th century. McKenna's approach is replete with contradiction. For example, his disdain towards psychic research in general is beguiling, given telepathy, channeling, and other paranormal phenomena are features endemic to his own contact with entities. Notably, the machine elves, and also to his mushroom-inspired decoding of the I Ching, giving rise to what he promoted as time wave zero. In addition to finding fault with the comparatively uninebriated legacy of Western esotericism, McKenna also expressed his objection to brotherhoods, orders, cults, from tribal cults to old world lodges to the Catholic Church. Now, I'm going to have to try and wind this up, but the exploratory approach I'm taking is that these trends, this approach echoes trends intrinsic to the American occult, as highlighted by Horowitz in Occult America. That is, the McKenna approach makes sense within a libertarian and egalitarian remit to augment self-transcendence and enable access to the mysteries among every man and woman via practical techniques. Typical to the tradition of the American occult offered by Horowitz is the advocacy of methods of spiritual transformation, self-transcendence, spirit contact, access to the mysteries that were available to all through an evolving series of techniques invented and promulgated by maverick personalities. This egalitarian technology is among the great legacies of the so-called burned over district, the region in upstate New York. In the early 19th century, they became a hotspot for intense religious revivalism, social reform movements, and spiritual experimentalism. So as I'm going to skip ahead. You'll have to get my book to find out about this, and my next book. But one thing I should mention is I think one of Terence's forebears that needs to be borne in mind is Pascal Beverly Randolph, the 19th century radical hashish evangelist and sex magician. Randolph had a eureka moment on hashish in 1860 that is comparable to McKenna's DMT flash, and was an early promulgator of psychonautical techniques. His beseechment was try, whereas Terence's was take it easy, but take it.
And what?
And we're going to skip forward. These are just a few of the so-called American shamans' raps. During his life and in his afterlife, McKenna became something of a logos for the global psychedelic underground, as his disembodied voice became spectral over the past 25 years. In strange mercurial fashion, he would become an informing voice for countless trippers. McKenna is among the most celebrated and least understood figures of the late 20th century. His mercurial stature echoes a paradoxical and contrarian attitude, an attitude reflected in an ambivalent approach to the occult. I regarded McKenna as something of an accidental occultist due to his dismissal and embrace of esoteric practices, to his prejudicial derogation and celebration of the occult. Sharing elements in common with the American occult tradition, McKenna was a charming autodidact promoting metabolic and mail-order pathways towards the mystery. He was the son of a light bulb salesman and was a tryptamine evangelist for whom magic plants and spirit molecules were integral to accessing one's other self. While McKenna was disdainful of and contemptuous towards esoteric and occult traditions, as a champion of tryptamines, he's become a leading voice of the psychedelic occult. And thank you.